The dust settled around Grace Zimmerman's boots as she sat on the weathered porch of her father's ranch house, watching the Texas sun bleed across the horizon in streaks of orange and crimson that reminded her of everything she had lost. It was the spring of 1878, and the land stretched endlessly before her, wild and unforgiving, much like the grief that had taken root in her chest since the fever had stolen both her parents within a week of each other just 2 months prior. She had turned 21 that winter, and instead of the life she had imagined, filled with dances and courtship, and the gentle rhythms of helping her mother tend the house, she found herself alone on 300 acres with cattle that needed branding, fences that needed mending, and a future as uncertain as tomorrow's weather. The ranch hands had drifted away after her father's death, unwilling to take orders from a woman, no matter how capable she proved herself to be. The wooden boards creaked beside her, and Grace felt rather than saw someone settle onto the porch step. She did not turn her head, did not acknowledge the presence, because she knew without looking that it was Vincent Irving, the cowboy who had appeared at her gate 3 weeks ago asking for work and a place to sleep. He had kind eyes the color of summer grass, and a quietness about him that made her feel less alone even when neither of them spoke. This had become their routine. Every evening as the sun painted the sky, Vincent would finish whatever task he had set himself to that day, wash up at the pump, and come sit beside her without a word. Sometimes they would remain in silence until the stars emerged. Sometimes one of them would speak, soft observations about the weather, or the cattle, or the way the wind moved through the mesquite trees. Tonight, Grace felt the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The bank had sent another letter, this one more pointed than the last. Her father had borrowed money to buy additional land 2 years ago, confident that the cattle prices would remain strong. But prices had fallen, and now the debt sat like a vulture waiting to pick clean whatever remained of her family's legacy. "My father built this house with his own hands," Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He and my mother came out here with nothing but a wagon and a dream. They survived droughts and Comanche raids and winters so cold the cattle froze standing up." Vincent did not respond immediately, and Grace appreciated that about him. He did not rush to fill silence with empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "My father lost everything he had in the war," Vincent said. "Came home to North Carolina to find our farm burned and my mother buried in an unmarked grave. He could not bear to rebuild, so he drank himself to death instead. I was 17 when I buried him next to her." Grace turned to look at him properly for the first time that evening. The fading light caught the sharp angles of his face, the scar that ran along his jaw from some past misfortune he had never explained. He was 24, she knew, though life had carved lines around his eyes that made him seem older. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry too," he replied. "For your loss." They sat in silence again, but it felt different now, weighted with shared understanding. A coyote called out somewhere in the distance, and the evening breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. "The bank is going to take this place," Grace said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Unless I can pay what is owed by the end of June." "How much?" Vincent asked. $800. She heard him exhale slowly. It might as well have been 8,000. Ranch hands made $30 a month if they were lucky, and Grace had barely scraped together enough to pay Vincent even that modest wage. "There has to be a way," Vincent said. Grace almost laughed, but it would have come out broken. "I have been over the numbers 100 times. Even if cattle prices rise and I sell the entire herd, I would still fall short. And without cattle, there is no ranch anyway." "Then we find another way," Vincent said, and something in his voice made her believe, just for a moment, that another way might exist. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn as she always did, dressed in one of her father's old shirts and a split riding skirt that scandalized the church ladies in town, and went out to help Vincent with the feeding. The cattle were scattered across the grazing lands, lean but healthy enough. Her father had always maintained a good herd, and Grace had learned from watching him which bulls to keep and which cows produced the strongest calves. Vincent was already at work, hauling feed from the barn with an efficiency that spoke of years of hard labor. He had shown up at her ranch in clothes worn thin and boots that had been resoled more times than was reasonable, but he worked harder than any 3 men she had ever known. He never complained, never shirked a task, and treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine regard. "I have been thinking," Vincent said as Grace helped him distribute the feed, "about your problem with the bank." "Our problem," Grace corrected. "If they take this ranch, you lose your position." Vincent's mouth quirked in something that was not quite a smile. "I have lost positions before. I am more concerned about you losing your home." "What were you thinking?" Grace asked, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her chest at his words. "There is a cattle drive forming up in San Antonio. They are looking for experienced drovers to help move a herd north to Dodge City. The pay is good, better than ranch work, and they are desperate enough that they might even take you on despite." He trailed off. "Despite my being a woman," Grace finished. "Despite the trail boss being an idiot if he turns down someone who knows cattle as well as you do," Vincent said firmly. Grace considered this as she scattered feed for a small group of yearlings. The idea was not without merit. Cattle drives paid well because the work was dangerous and grueling. Men died on the trail from stampedes, river crossings, disease, and sometimes from each other when tensions ran high. But if she could survive the 2 months it would take to reach Dodge City, she might earn enough to at least reduce her debt and buy herself more time. "They would never take a woman," Grace said, though part of her desperately wanted to believe otherwise. "Not as a cook or a camp follower," Vincent agreed. "But if you dressed like a man and kept your head down, you might pass, at least until we are far enough from San Antonio that they would not want to turn back." Grace said. "You do not think I would let you do something that foolish alone, do you?" Vincent said, and there was something fierce in his eyes that made Grace's breath catch. She looked away, focusing on the cattle, on the familiar landscape of her home. The risk was enormous. If she were discovered, the humiliation would be the least of her problems. Trail bosses did not take kindly to deception, and cowboys could be brutal to women who invaded their masculine domain. But what choice did she have? Sit on her porch and watch while the bank auctioned off everything her parents had built? How would it work? Grace asked. Over the next hour, as they finished the morning chores, Vincent laid out his plan. Grace would cut her hair, bind her chest, and take on the name George Zane. She had spent enough time working the ranch that her hands were calloused and her skin sun-browned. She could rope and ride as well as most men, and her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. The key would be keeping to herself, not drawing attention and letting Vincent run interference when necessary. "What about the ranch while we are gone?" Grace asked. "Do you have anyone you trust? Someone who could watch over the place?" Grace thought of Martha Henderson, her nearest neighbor and one of the few women in the county who had not treated her like a pariah after her parents died. Martha's husband had passed years ago, and she ran her own smaller spread with the help of her 2 grown sons. She would understand, perhaps, what Grace was trying to do. "I might," Grace said. "I would have to ask." "Then ask today," Vincent said. "The drive leaves in a week. If we are going to do this, we need to move quickly." That afternoon, Grace rode the 5 miles to the Henderson ranch, her mind churning with doubt and determination in equal measure. Martha was hanging laundry when Grace arrived, and her weathered face broke into a smile that faded when she saw Grace's expression. "What is wrong, child?" Martha asked, setting down her basket. Grace explained everything, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. She told Martha about the debt, about Vincent's plan, about her desperation to save the only home she had ever known. She expected Martha to tell her she was insane, that no decent woman would even consider such a thing. Instead, Martha listened quietly until Grace finished, then nodded slowly. "Your father would have done the same," Martha said. "He was never one to give up without a fight. Then you will help?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. "My boys and I will look after your place like it was our own," Martha said. "And when you come back with your head held high and money in your pocket, you can tell me all about the adventure." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, and Martha pulled her into a fierce embrace that smelled of lye soap and sunshine. "You be careful out there," Martha whispered. "The world is not kind to women who step outside the lines they have drawn for us. But sometimes stepping outside those lines is the only way to survive." The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Grace cut her long brown hair with her mother's sewing scissors, watching in the mirror as each lock fell away. When she was finished, she looked like a stranger, a lean-faced young man with eyes too old for his apparent years. She practiced lowering her voice, moving differently, taking up more space the way men did without thinking about it. Vincent worked with her every evening, critiquing her performance, suggesting adjustments. He taught her to spit properly, to walk with a swagger that spoke of confidence rather than the careful steps women were trained to take. He showed her how to roll cigarettes, though she did not smoke them, and how to curse with the casual profanity that punctuated cowboy conversation. "You will do fine," Vincent said the night before they were set to leave for San Antonio. "Just remember to stay quiet and keep your head down. Let them underestimate you. That will be your greatest advantage." They were sitting on the porch again, and Grace felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her like a heavy blanket. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, her future balanced on a knife's edge. "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked suddenly. "You could have moved on to another ranch, another job. You do not owe me anything." Vincent was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "When I came here, I was at the end of my rope," he said. "I had been drifting for years, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots or make connections. I was tired, Grace. Tired of being alone, tired of having nothing and no one to care about. And then I knocked on your gate, and you looked at me like I was a person worth knowing instead of just another drifter. You gave me work and respect and a reason to stay in one place. So if you think I am going to abandon you now when you need help, you do not know me at all." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to reach out to take his hand, to tell him that he had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. But she was afraid of what it might mean, afraid of losing even this fragile connection if she pushed for more. "Thank you," she whispered instead. "Do not thank me yet," Vincent said with a hint of his rare smile. "Wait until we survive this fool adventure you have gotten us into." They rode into San Antonio on a Tuesday morning, the city bustling with commerce and noise that made Grace's head spin after weeks of relative solitude on the ranch. The cattle drive was gathering at the stockyards on the edge of town, and Grace could see the massive herd already assembled, thousands of longhorns milling about under the watchful eyes of mounted cowboys. The trail boss was a hard-eyed man named Cyrus Pike, who looked Grace up and down with obvious skepticism when Vincent introduced her as George Zane, his younger cousin looking for work. "You ever been on a drive before, boy?" Pike asked. "No, sir," Grace said, keeping her voice low and steady. "But I know cattle and I know horses. I can pull my weight." "He is good with a rope," Vincent added, "and he does not complain." Pike spat tobacco juice onto the ground and considered. "We are short 3 men since half the crew I hired got drunk last night and ended up in jail. You can ride drag for now. If you cannot keep up, I will leave you in the dust." "Understood." "Understood," Grace said. They were in. The next 2 days were spent organizing the herd and finalizing supplies. Grace kept to herself as much as possible, speaking only when spoken to and avoiding eye contact with the other drovers. There were 15 men in total, a mix of experienced hands and younger cowboys looking for adventure and easy money. Most ignored her entirely, dismissing her as just another green kid who would probably wash out before they reached the Red River. Vincent stayed close without being obvious about it, and Grace was grateful for his steady presence. At night, when they bedded down around the campfire, she positioned herself on the outskirts of the group, claiming exhaustion to avoid conversation. The drive began on a Thursday morning, the herd stretching out in a long line as Pike gave the order to move out. Grace was assigned to drag, the worst and dustiest position, responsible for keeping the stragglers moving and eating everyone else's dust. It was miserable work, but she threw herself into it with grim determination, refusing to give Pike any reason to send her packing. The days fell into a brutal rhythm. They woke before dawn, gulped down coffee and whatever breakfast the cook had prepared, then spent 12 to 14 hours in the saddle keeping the massive herd moving north. The dust was constant, coating everything, working its way into Grace's nose and mouth and eyes until she thought she might never be clean again. Her muscles ached, her skin burned from the sun, and every night she collapsed into her bedroll so exhausted that even the hard ground felt like a feather bed. But she did not complain. She did the work, followed orders, and slowly began to earn a grudging respect from some of the other drovers who had expected her to quit within the first week. Vincent rode point most days, one of the more experienced men trusted to guide the herd in the right direction. But every evening he would find Grace, check on her with a look or a quiet word, make sure she had eaten and was holding up under the strain. 2 weeks into the drive, they reached the Brazos River, swollen with spring rains and running fast. River crossings were among the most dangerous parts of any cattle drive, and Grace felt her stomach clench with anxiety as Pike surveyed the churning water. "We crossed today," Pike announced. "Get the herd moving. Point riders in first, then ease the cattle in steady. No rushing, no spooking them, or we will have a disaster on our hands." Vincent was one of the first into the river, his horse plunging into the brown water with steady determination. The cattle balked at first, as they always did, but eventually the lead steers entered the water and the rest followed. Grace waited with the drag riders, watching as hundreds of longhorns disappeared into the river, their heads bobbing above the surface as they swam. Then it was her turn. Grace urged her horse forward, feeling the shock of cold water rising up her legs as they waded deeper. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, pulling at her horse, threatening to sweep them downstream. She gripped the saddle horn and focused on keeping her mount calm and moving forward. They were halfway across when she heard the shout. One of the younger drovers, a kid named Tommy who could not have been more than 18, had been swept off his horse. Grace saw him thrashing in the water, his face a mask of panic as the current dragged him under. Without thinking, Grace turned her horse toward the struggling cowboy. Vincent was already moving, driving his horse through the water with powerful strokes, but he was too far away. Grace pushed her mount harder, fighting the current until she was close enough to grab Tommy's flailing arm. "Stop fighting," she yelled. "Grab the saddle." Tommy's fingers found purchase on her saddle, and Grace hauled him against her horse's flank. The added weight made her mount struggle, but the horse was strong and well-trained. Together they fought their way to the far bank, emerging from the water in a rush of movement and noise. Tommy collapsed on the ground, coughing up river water, while Grace tried to catch her breath and calm her shaking hands. The other drovers had gathered around, and Vincent appeared at her side, his face pale. "That was damn stupid," he said quietly, but his eyes were warm with something that might have been pride. "The kid would have drowned," Grace replied. Pike pushed through the crowd and looked down at Tommy, then at Grace. "Good work, Zane. You have got guts. I will give you that." The respect in his voice was unmistakable, and Grace felt something shift in the way the other men regarded her. She was no longer just the green kid on drag. She had proven herself in a way that mattered. That night, around the campfire, the drovers were more talkative than usual. The successful river crossing had everyone in good spirits, and someone produced a bottle of whiskey that was passed around. Grace accepted it when it came to her, took a small sip that burned her throat, and passed it on. Tommy sought her out, his face earnest in the firelight. "I owe you my life," he said. "I do not even know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Grace said. "Anyone would have done the same." But she knew that was not true. In the chaos of the crossing, with cattle everywhere and the current so strong, most men would have focused on their own survival. She had risked her life for a stranger, and word of it would spread. Vincent sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You trying to get yourself killed?" he murmured. "I was trying to save someone," Grace replied. "Same thing sometimes," Vincent said, but there was no real anger in his voice. As the weeks passed and they pushed farther north across Indian Territory, Grace found herself settling into the rhythm of the drive. She was still cautious, still careful not to reveal herself, but the constant vigilance became second nature. She learned the personalities of the other drovers, figured out who to avoid and who might be friendly. There was Samuel, the segundo who served as Pike's right hand, a serious man in his 30s who rarely smiled but was scrupulously fair. There was old Pete, who claimed to have been on every major cattle drive since the war and told stories that were probably 90% fabrication, but entertaining nonetheless. There were the brothers Jake and Matthew, always competing with each other but fiercely loyal when it mattered. And there was Vincent, constant and steady, her anchor in all the chaos. Grace found herself watching him when she thought no one would notice. The way he moved in the saddle, easy and confident. The way he spoke to the other men, commanding respect without demanding it. The way his rare smiles transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less burdened. She was falling in love with him. Grace realized one night as she lay in her bedroll staring up at the vast expanse of stars. It was foolish and impossible and the worst possible timing, but her heart did not seem to care about practicalities. Every day she spent in his company made her feel more certain that Vincent Irving was the kind of man she wanted beside her for the rest of her life. But how could she tell him? She was pretending to be someone else, lying to everyone around her, and Vincent was risking his reputation and possibly his safety to help her maintain that lie. What if her feelings were one-sided? What if Vincent saw her only as a responsibility, a debt to be repaid? They were 6 weeks into the drive when the Comanche appeared. Grace had heard stories her whole life about the fierce warriors who had ruled the Texas plains before the army, and the rangers and the relentless press of settlement had pushed them onto reservations. Her father had fought them in his younger days, and had spoken of them with a respect that bordered on admiration, even as he acknowledged the violence that had marked the conflict. The band that approached the herd numbered perhaps 20 warriors, mounted on paint horses and armed with rifles as well as traditional weapons. Pike called for the drovers to gather, but not to draw weapons unless provoked. The Comanche leader rode forward alone, and Pike went out to meet him. Grace watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She could see Vincent positioned near Pike, ready to intervene if negotiations went badly. After a tense conversation that involved much hand gesturing and careful diplomacy, Pike rode back to the herd. "They want 10 cattle," he announced. "Payment for crossing their land. I am inclined to give it to them rather than start a fight we might not win." There was grumbling among some of the drovers, but most recognized the wisdom of avoiding a conflict. 10 cattle were nothing compared to the whole herd, and fighting would likely result in dead men on both sides. The Comanche took their payment and disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, and the drive continued north. But the encounter left Grace shaken. She had been so focused on the immediate challenges of the drive, on maintaining her disguise and doing the work, that she had not fully considered all the dangers that surrounded them. They were traveling through a land still raw with conflict, where violence could erupt without warning. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. She slipped away from the camp, walking out into the darkness until the firelight was just a distant glow. The prairie stretched endlessly around her, alien and beautiful under the stars. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Vincent. "You should not wander off alone," he said quietly. "I needed to think," Grace replied. Vincent came to stand beside her and they looked out at the darkness together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Grace said. "How strange it is to be here, pretending to be someone I am not. How terrifying and exhilarating this whole adventure has been. How much I miss my home and how much I do not want this to end." "You do not want to go home?" Vincent asked, and she heard the surprise in his voice. "I want to go home," Grace clarified, "but I do not want to stop being near you." The words were out before she could stop them, and Grace felt her face flush with embarrassment even in the darkness. She had revealed too much, shown her hand too clearly. Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her real name since the drive began. "I have been trying so damn hard not to care about you the way I do, trying to tell myself that you deserve better than a drifter with nothing to his name. But every day I spend with you makes it harder to pretend I do not feel what I feel." Grace turned to face him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "And what do you feel?" "Like you are the first real home I have had since my parents died," Vincent said. "Like if I lost you now, I would spend the rest of my life looking for something I could never find again. Like I am in love with you and have been since the first time you looked at me like I mattered." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not care. She reached up with her free hand and touched Vincent's face, tracing the line of his scar with her fingers. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since the first time you sat beside me on that porch without saying a word." Vincent pulled her close, and Grace buried her face against his chest, feeling his arms wrap around her like a shield against everything the world might throw at them. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the vast Texas sky, and Grace felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since before her parents died. Eventually, they walked back to camp hand in hand, and though they separated before rejoining the others, something fundamental had shifted between them. Grace caught Vincent's eye across the campfire and saw her own happiness reflected there. The drive pushed on through Indian Territory and into Kansas. They crossed the Arkansas River without incident and navigated through towns that were barely more than collections of ramshackle buildings thrown up to service the cattle trade. Grace had been on the trail for nearly 8 weeks now, and she was lean and hard from the constant work, her disguise so ingrained that she sometimes forgot she was pretending. They were 3 days out from Dodge City when disaster struck. The storm came out of nowhere, a towering wall of black clouds that swallowed the sky. The cattle spooked, as cattle always did in storms, and suddenly 3,000 longhorns were running blind across the prairie in a stampede that shook the ground like an earthquake. Grace was on night watch when it started, and she kicked her horse into a gallop without thinking, racing alongside the herd in a desperate attempt to turn the leaders and stop the stampede before it ran out of control. Around her, she could hear the other drovers shouting, see them working to contain the chaos. Lightning split the sky, and in the flash of illumination Grace saw Vincent ahead of her, dangerously close to the surging mass of horns and hooves. She pushed her horse harder, trying to reach him, when her mount stepped in a prairie dog hole. The world tilted sickeningly. Grace felt herself flying through the air, then the brutal impact as she hit the ground. Pain exploded through her left arm and ribs, and she could not breathe, could not move, could only watch in horror as the stampede thundered toward her. Then Vincent was there, somehow having seen her fall. He threw himself from his horse and grabbed Grace, hauling her bodily out of the path of the herd with seconds to spare. They rolled together into a shallow depression in the ground, and Vincent covered Grace with his own body as the cattle stampeded past on either side. The noise was deafening, the ground shaking so violently Grace thought it might crack open beneath them. She clung to Vincent, feeling his heart hammering against her chest, and prayed that the depression was deep enough to keep them safe. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before the main body of the herd passed. The thunder of hooves faded into the distance, and the storm began to break up as quickly as it had formed. Vincent pushed himself up carefully, his face tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" Grace tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through her ribs. "My arm," she managed, "and my ribs. I think something is broken." "Do not move," Vincent said. He checked her over with gentle hands, and Grace saw his expression darken when he pressed against her left ribs and she cried out. "Definitely broken. Your arm too, I think." Other drovers were beginning to appear, looking for casualties. Pike rode up and dismounted, his face grim in the dim light. "How bad?" he asked. "Broken ribs and arm," Vincent said. "He needs a doctor." Pike looked down at Grace with something that might have been sympathy. "Nearest doctor is in Dodge City. We will rig a travois and get him there, but the herd is scattered to hell and back. It is going to take days to round them all up." "I will take him," Vincent said immediately. "We can make Dodge by tomorrow if we ride through the night." Pike considered, then nodded. "Get him there safe. You have earned at least that much." Vincent fashioned a crude sling for Grace's arm using his bandana, then helped her onto his horse. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but Grace bit down on her protests. Vincent mounted behind her, his arms coming around to hold the reins and support her at the same time. They rode through what remained of the night and into the next day. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain and exhaustion overwhelming her body's ability to cope. She was vaguely aware of Vincent's steady presence, his voice murmuring encouragement, his arms keeping her secure in the saddle. When they finally reached Dodge City, the sun was high in the sky and Grace was running a fever. Vincent carried her into the doctor's office, and the doctor, an older man named Harrison, took one look at Grace and started barking orders. "Get him on the table." "What happened?" "Horse went down in a stampede," Vincent said. "Broken arm and ribs." Dr. Harrison began cutting away Grace's shirt, and Vincent suddenly understood what was about to happen. He moved to block the doctor's view, but it was too late. Harrison paused, his scissors hovering over the bindings Grace had wrapped around her chest, then looked up at Vincent with raised eyebrows. "Would you like to explain?" the doctor asked mildly. "It is complicated," Vincent said. "I am sure it is. Wait outside while I examine the patient." Vincent hesitated, then stepped into the waiting room. He paced like a caged animal, his mind racing. The secret was out, at least with the doctor. Would Harrison report it to the marshal? Would Pike find out? Would Grace's entire plan fall apart because of an accident? After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Harrison emerged. "3 broken ribs and a fractured ulna," he reported. "I have splinted the arm and wrapped the ribs. She needs rest and time to heal. No riding for at least 6 weeks. Vincent said, even though there was no point in denying it anymore. "I have been a doctor for 30 years, son. I know a woman when I see one, even one dressed in men's clothes and covered in trail dust. What I do not know is why you are both pretending otherwise." Vincent made a decision then, trusting his instincts about the kind man in front of him. He explained everything: the debt, the ranch, the desperate plan to earn money on the cattle drive. Harrison listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. "She must love that ranch a great deal," the doctor said when Vincent finished. "It is all she has left of her family," Vincent replied. "And what is she to you?" "Everything," Vincent said simply. Harrison smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "You can see her now. And do not worry. I am not in the habit of betraying my patients' confidences." Grace was awake when Vincent entered the small back room, propped up on pillows with her arms splinted and her ribs wrapped tight. She looked small and vulnerable, all the toughness of the trail stripped away to reveal the young woman beneath. "I am sorry," Grace said immediately. "I ruined everything." Vincent pulled a chair close to the bed and took her good hand in both of his. "You did not ruin anything. The doctor is not going to say anything, and Pike does not need to know. We will figure this out." "How?" Grace asked. "I cannot rejoin the drive like this, and even if I could, I have lost weeks of wages." "The herd should arrive in Dodge within the week," Vincent said. "I will collect my wages and yours for the work we have already done. It will not be as much as we hoped, but it is something." Grace closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "It will not be enough. Even with what we have earned, I will still fall short of what I owe the bank." "Then we will find another way," Vincent said firmly. "Grace, look at me." She opened her eyes and Vincent held her gaze. "I am not going to let you lose your home," he said. "Do you understand? We will figure this out together, even if I have to rob a damn bank myself." Despite everything, Grace laughed, then winced as the movement jarred her ribs. "Please do not rob a bank." "Then trust me," Vincent said. "Trust us. We have come this far. We are not giving up now." Grace squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Dr. Harrison insisted that Grace stay in town for at least a week, while her injuries began to heal. He rented rooms above his practice to patients who needed extended care, and Vincent paid for Grace to stay there using some of the money he had saved. Vincent himself took a room in a boarding house and spent his days working odd jobs around Dodge City to earn extra cash. The town was booming with cattle season in full swing, and there was always work for someone willing to do it. He mucked out stables, repaired fences, helped unload freight wagons, anything that paid. In the evenings, he would visit Grace. bringing her dinner and news of the day. They talked for hours, making plans, sharing dreams, learning the small details of each other's lives that had been impossible to discuss on the trail. Grace told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her mother's love of music and her father's terrible jokes. She told him about the time she had tried to tame a wild Mustang and ended up with a broken collarbone, and about the first time she had successfully delivered a breech calf. Vincent told her about growing up in North Carolina, about the beauty of the mountains before the war destroyed everything. He told her about the men he had worked with over the years, the places he had drifted through, the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow. "I never thought I would find a place to belong again," Vincent admitted one evening. "I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that caring about people only led to pain." "What changed?" Grace asked. "You," Vincent said. "From the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. Like we were two pieces of the same puzzle, separated by chance and circumstance. And when you let me stay, when you treated me like I had value, I started to believe that maybe I could have a home again." Grace reached out with her good hand and touched his face. "You do have a home. With me. No matter what happens with the ranch, you will always have a home with me." Vincent kissed her then, gently because of her injuries, but with all the emotion that had been building between them since that first evening on the porch. Grace kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into the connection, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Vincent said. Grace blinked, sure she had misheard. "What? Marry me?" Vincent repeated. "I know this is not how it is supposed to be done. I should court you properly, ask your father's permission, save up for a ring, but I do not care about any of that. I love you, Grace Zimmerman, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Marry me." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Dodge City. Dr. Harrison and his wife served as witnesses, and Grace wore a simple dress that Mrs. Harrison had loaned her. Vincent had used the last of his savings to buy a thin gold band from the general store, and when he slipped it onto Grace's finger, she felt her heart might burst with happiness. The ceremony was brief and simple, nothing like the elaborate wedding Grace had occasionally imagined as a girl. But standing there in the preacher's tent with Vincent's hand in hers, speaking vows that bound them together for the rest of their lives, Grace could not imagine anything more perfect. When Pike and the herd arrived in Dodge City 5 days later, Vincent met them at the stockyards. He collected the wages owed to both him and George Zane, accepting Pike's handshake and his gruff compliments on a job well done. "Your cousin make it okay?" Pike asked. "He is going to be fine," Vincent said. "Thank you for asking. He is a good kid," Pike said. "Tough as nails. You tell him if he ever wants work on another drive, he should look me up." Vincent promised he would pass along the message, privately amused at the idea of Grace returning to the cattle trails. With the wages from the drive added to what Vincent had earned doing odd jobs around town, they had nearly $600. It was more money than either of them had ever possessed at one time, but it was still $200 short of what Grace owed the bank. Vincent sat on the edge of Grace's bed that evening, counting and recounting the money as if doing so might make more appear. Grace watched him, her heart aching at the frustration evident in every line of his body. "We tried," she said softly. "No one could have asked for more than what you have done." "It is not enough," Vincent said flatly. "Then we will go back to the ranch and we will fight for every extra day we can get," Grace said. "Maybe cattle prices will rise. Maybe we can sell some equipment. Maybe a miracle will happen. But even if we lose the ranch, Vincent, we have each other. That is worth more than all the land in Texas." Vincent set the money aside and gathered Grace carefully into his arms. "I love you," he said fiercely, "and I swear to you that somehow, some way, I am going to give you the life you deserve." "You already have," Grace said. They left Dodge City 2 weeks after Grace's accident, moving slowly to accommodate her still healing injuries. The journey back to Texas took longer than the drive north had, but Grace found she did not mind. For the first time in months, she was not racing against a deadline or hiding her identity. She was simply Grace Irving, traveling home with her husband. They stopped in small towns along the way, staying in boarding houses that were clean but modest. Vincent was careful with their remaining money, knowing they would need every dollar when they reached home. At night, in whatever room they had rented, they would lie together and talk about the future, building castles in the air even as reality waited to tear them down. Grace's injuries healed slowly but steadily. By the time they crossed back into Texas, she could ride for a full day without exhausting herself, though her ribs still ached when she breathed deeply. They reached the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, and Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at the sight of her home. Everything looked just as they had left it. Martha Henderson had kept her word, and the cattle were grazing contentedly, the fences were intact, and the house stood proud against the Texas sky. Martha herself rode over that evening, and her face split into a wide smile when she saw Grace and Vincent together. "I knew it," Martha crowed. "I told my boys that there was more between you two than just ranch work. Let me see the ring." Grace showed her the simple gold band, and Martha squeezed her hand with genuine affection. "I am happy for you both. Your parents would have approved, Grace. They would have wanted you to be happy." "Thank you," Grace said, "for everything, for watching the ranch, for believing in me, for not trying to talk me out of something crazy." "Sometimes crazy is the only sensible option," Martha said with a wink. Then her expression turned serious. "What are you going to do about the bank?" Grace and Vincent exchanged glances. "We are still short," Vincent admitted. "We earned good money on the drive, but not enough. We have until the end of the month to come up with the rest." Martha was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. Then she said, "How much do you need?" $200, Grace said. Martha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the land that stretched beyond the Zimmerman ranch. "I have been thinking," she said slowly. "My boys are grown men now with their own ideas about ranching. They have been talking about heading west to Montana, trying their luck in new territory. I'm getting older, and running my place alone is becoming harder every year." She turned back to face them. "What if we combined our spreads? Your land borders mine, and together they would make a decent-sized operation. I could sell my cattle and use the money to help you pay off the bank. In return, I would live here with you, help run things, and when I die, everything I own becomes yours." Grace felt her jaw drop. "Martha, that is too much. We could not ask you to give up your independence." "You are not asking. I am offering," Martha said firmly. "I have been alone in that house for 8 years, and the truth is, I am tired of the loneliness. I would rather spend my remaining years surrounded by people I care about, helping to build something that will last, than stubbornly clinging to my own little piece of land until it kills me." Vincent looked at Grace, and she could see the hope dawning in his eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked Martha. "I have never been more certain of anything," Martha replied. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Martha's sons helped move her belongings to the Zimmerman ranch, and Martha herself settled into one of the spare bedrooms with the satisfaction of someone who had found exactly where they were meant to be. They sold Martha's cattle at market, and the proceeds, combined with what Grace and Vincent had earned, were more than enough to satisfy the bank. On the last day of June, Grace and Vincent walked into the El Dorado Canyon Bank and paid off the debt in full. The banker, a pinched-faced man who had clearly been looking forward to foreclosing on the property, could barely hide his disappointment as he marked the loan satisfied and handed over the deed. Grace held the piece of paper that proved she owned her home free and clear, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for months. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," Vincent corrected. "You were willing to risk everything to save your home." "I just helped where I could." "We did it together," Grace insisted. "And we are going to build something amazing here, together." They walked out of the bank hand in hand, and Grace looked up at the Texas sky, clear and blue and infinite with possibility. Her parents were gone, but their legacy lived on in this land, in this ranch that had been saved through courage and determination and love. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Vincent proved to be as skilled at running a ranch as he was at driving cattle, and under his and Grace's combined management, the operation prospered. They expanded the herd, improved their breeding stock, and earned a reputation for producing some of the finest cattle in the county. Martha became the grandmother Grace had never had, dispensing wisdom and occasional tartness in equal measure. She taught Grace how to can vegetables and make preserves, skills her mother had never quite gotten around to passing on. She taught Vincent how to keep books properly, ensuring that they always knew exactly where they stood financially. In the spring of 1880, Grace gave birth to a son they named William after Vincent's father. He was a strong, healthy baby with his mother's brown eyes and his father's quiet disposition. Grace had been terrified throughout the pregnancy, remembering how many women died in childbirth, but Martha and the local midwife had guided her through it with competent care. Vincent wept when he held his son for the first time, and Grace fell in love with her husband all over again, watching him cradle the tiny infant with such tender care. 2 years later, a daughter followed, and they named her Clara after Grace's mother. She was as different from her brother as night from day, loud and demanding, and full of personality from the moment she entered the world. The ranch house that had once been so quiet and lonely became filled with the noise of children growing up. There were scraped knees and childhood illnesses, first words and first steps, laughter and tears, and all the chaos that came with raising a family. Martha lived to see both children grow into school age, then passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, her work complete and her life fulfilled. They buried her on a hill overlooking the combined ranches, and Grace made sure fresh flowers were placed on her grave every week without fail. As the children grew older, Vincent taught William how to rope and ride, passing on the skills that had sustained him through years of drifting. Grace taught Clara how to manage a household, but also how to keep books and evaluate cattle, ensuring that her daughter would never be helpless in a world that often underestimated women. In 1885, when Grace was 28 and Vincent was 31, they sat together on the porch one evening watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and crimson. The children were inside doing their lessons under the watchful eye of a young woman from town who came in 3 days a week to help with the household. "You ever think about that first night?" Grace asked, her head resting on Vincent's shoulder. "When you sat down beside me without saying a word, all the time," Vincent said. "I think about how lost I felt before I found you, how empty my life was, how close I came to just drifting past your gate without stopping." "I am glad you stopped," Grace said. "So am I," Vincent replied. "Every single day, I am grateful that I found the courage to knock on your gate and ask for work." Grace lifted her head and kissed him, still feeling the same flutter in her chest that she had felt that first time in the darkness outside Dodge City. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Vincent replied. "Always." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, and Grace thought about everything they had built together. The thriving ranch that supported not just their family but several hired hands who had become like extended family. The children who were growing up strong and capable, learning to love the land as much as she did. The partnership she shared with Vincent, built on mutual respect and deep affection, and the kind of love that only grew stronger with time. She thought about the girl she had been, sitting alone on this same porch, drowning in grief and fear and uncertainty. That girl could never have imagined the life Grace lived now, could never have dreamed that from such desperate circumstances could come such abundant joy. But life had a way of surprising you, Grace had learned. Sometimes the cowboy who sat beside you without a word turned out to be exactly the partner you needed. Sometimes the risks you took out of desperation led you to exactly where you were meant to be. Sometimes loss and love were intertwined so tightly that you could not have one without the other, and the pain of what you had lost made the joy of what you found that much sweeter. The sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Vincent's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did on a working ranch. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, this quiet acknowledgement of everything they had overcome and everything they had become. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the evening sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the whisper of wind through the grass, the voices of her children drifting through the open window. This was home, she thought. Not just the land or the house, but this feeling of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be with exactly the person she was meant to be with. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the steady rhythm of ranch life. William grew into a serious young man who shared his father's gift with horses and his mother's head for business. Clara developed a stubborn streak that reminded everyone of Grace at her age, along with a fearless approach to life that occasionally gave her parents gray hairs. In 1890, when a particularly harsh winter threatened to devastate their herd, it was William, now 14, who suggested they drive the cattle to lower ground early, before the worst of the storms hit. His instincts proved correct, and while other ranchers lost significant numbers, the Irving herd survived largely intact. "That is my boy," Vincent said proudly when the danger had passed. "Smart and brave, just like his mother." "He gets the brave from you," Grace countered, but her eyes were warm with pride. That same year, Clara announced that she wanted to learn to keep the ranch books, not just as a backup but as her primary responsibility. She was 12 years old and absolutely certain of what she wanted, and Grace saw herself reflected in her daughter's determination. "The world is changing," Clara said. "Women are going to college now, running businesses. I want to be ready for whatever comes." Grace taught her everything she knew, and soon discovered that Clara had a natural aptitude for numbers and organization that exceeded her own. The student had surpassed the teacher, and Grace could not have been more delighted. In 1893, Grace and Vincent celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. They did not do anything elaborate, just a quiet dinner after the children had gone to bed, but Grace felt the weight of those 15 years, all the joys and sorrows, all the challenges overcome and victories celebrated. "Do you remember what you said to me in Dodge City?" Grace asked. "When you proposed," Vincent smiled. "I said I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. And do you still?" Grace teased. Vincent reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Even more than I did then." "You have given me a life I never dreamed I could have, Grace. A home, a family, a purpose. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." "You gave me the same," Grace said softly. "You saved my home, but more than that, you saved me. I was so lost when you arrived, and you helped me find my way back." They held hands across the table, and Grace marveled at how her love for this man continued to deepen and evolve. The passionate intensity of those early days had mellowed into something steadier, but no less powerful. A love that was woven into the fabric of their daily lives, present in every shared glance and gentle touch. As the century drew to a close, the Irving Ranch stood as a testament to what could be built through hard work, courage, and unwavering partnership. Other ranchers sought Vincent's advice on breeding and land management. Grace became known throughout the county as a woman who could evaluate cattle with the best of them, and who ran her operation with fairness and intelligence. William, at 18, had grown into a man who was ready to take on more responsibility. Vincent began teaching him the finer points of ranch management, preparing him for the day when the operation would pass to the next generation. Clara, at 16, had become the ranch's unofficial accountant, keeping meticulous books and projecting future expenses and income with impressive accuracy. She also had 3 young men courting her, much to Vincent's dismay and Grace's amusement. "She is too young to be thinking about marriage," Vincent grumbled one evening. "I was 21 when I married you," Grace pointed out. "And Clara is far more level-headed than I was at her age. She will make the right choice when she is ready." In 1899, as the new century approached, Grace stood on her porch once again watching the sunset. She was 42 now, with silver threading through her brown hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting at the Texas sun. Vincent stood beside her, his own hair gone mostly gray, but his eyes were still that same summer green that had captured her attention so many years ago. Their children were both in town, William courting a rancher's daughter and Clara attending a lecture on modern accounting practices that was being held at the church. The house was quiet, and Grace and Vincent had the evening to themselves. 21 years, Grace said softly. "Can you believe it has been 21 years since you first sat beside me on this porch?" Vincent wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "Best decision I ever made. Not saying a word, just sitting down and being present. I think I knew even then that you were going to change my life." "We changed each other's lives," Grace said. "I could not have survived without you, Vincent. And I do not just mean saving the ranch. I mean truly survived with my heart intact and my hope alive. You gave me that." "You gave me a reason to stop running," Vincent replied. "A reason to believe that I could be more than just a drifter moving from place to place. You gave me roots, Grace. You gave me everything." They watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in those same brilliant shades that had provided the backdrop to so many important moments in their lives. This land that Grace's parents had carved out of the wilderness, this ranch that she and Vincent had fought so hard to save, and had worked so hard to build into something prosperous and lasting. It would continue on after they were gone, passed down to their children and their children's children. But more than the land or the house or the cattle, what they were passing on was the knowledge that love and partnership could overcome almost any obstacle. That courage and determination could turn desperation into triumph. That sometimes the best things in life came from the most unlikely places, from chance meetings and desperate gambles and quiet moments of connection. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and Grace leaned her head against Vincent's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, strong and sure and constant. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Vincent replied. "Always and forever." And there on that porch, in the gathering darkness of a Texas evening, with the land they loved stretching out around them and a future full of promise waiting for their children. Grace and Vincent Irving held each other close and were content. The new century arrived with celebration and anticipation throughout the county. Grace and Vincent hosted a party at the ranch, inviting neighboring families and the hands who worked for them. William brought his sweetheart, a sensible young woman named Margaret who loved horses almost as much as he did. Clara danced with all three of her suitors and made none of them any promises, enjoying her freedom and her youth. In the spring of 1900, William married Margaret in a ceremony held at the ranch, and Grace cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman he loved. Vincent stood beside her, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and squeezed her hand. "Our boy is all grown up," he murmured. "He is a good man," Grace replied. "You taught him well." "We taught him well," Vincent corrected. William and Margaret built a house on the far side of the property, close enough to be part of the operation but far enough to have their own space. Within a year, Grace and Vincent became grandparents to a healthy baby boy named Thomas, and Grace discovered that loving a grandchild brought its own unique joy. Clara, never one to follow a conventional path, announced in 1902 that she was not interested in marriage but was interested in attending a women's college in the East to study business and mathematics. Grace and Vincent had long discussions about this unprecedented step, but in the end, they supported their daughter's ambitions. "The world is changing," Grace said. "Women have more opportunities now than when I was her age. Why should we hold her back from pursuing her dreams?" So Clara went east to school, writing long letters home about her classes and her fellow students and the bewildering pace of city life. She graduated with honors in 1906 and returned to Texas with a head full of modern business practices and a determination to apply them to the ranch. Under Clara's guidance, the Irving Ranch became one of the most efficiently run operations in the state. She implemented new accounting systems, negotiated better prices for their cattle, and even convinced her parents to invest in some of the new farming equipment that was becoming available. William, meanwhile, had developed their breeding program to the point where Irving cattle were sought after throughout Texas and beyond. He had his father's patience and his mother's eye for quality, and together those traits made him exceptionally skilled at his work. By 1910, Grace was 53 and Vincent was 57, and they had begun to step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, trusting their children to manage the operation while they enjoyed a somewhat slower pace of life. Grace spent her mornings tending an extensive vegetable garden and her afternoons playing with her grandchildren. Thomas had been joined by two sisters and a brother, and William and Margaret were talking about building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Clara, to everyone's surprise, including perhaps her own, had fallen in love with a professor of agriculture she had met at a conference in Austin. He was a kind man named Robert, who shared her passion for efficiency and innovation, and they married in 1911 in a simple ceremony that reflected Clara's practical nature. Vincent's hair had gone completely white, and he moved a bit slower than he once had, but his eyes were still sharp and his mind was still keen. He spent his days working with the horses, training the young ones and gentling the wild ones, and everyone agreed that Vincent Irving could talk to horses in a language only they understood. One evening in the summer of 1912, Grace and Vincent sat on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had done countless times over the past 34 years. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. William and Margaret were walking hand in hand toward their own house, and Clara and Robert were inside discussing some new idea for crop rotation. "We built something good here," Grace said contentedly. "Something that will last." "We did," Vincent agreed. "Your parents would be proud of what you have done with their legacy." "What we have done," Grace corrected, as she always did. "I could never have managed any of this without you." Vincent smiled and took her hand, his thumb tracing over her wedding ring, worn thin after all these years but still bright. "Do you remember that first night," he asked, "when I sat down beside you without saying anything?" "I was so lost," Grace said, "drowning in grief and fear. And then you were just there, solid and steady, asking nothing from me but willing to give everything." "I did not know how to tell you that I understood," Vincent said. "How to say that I had been where you were, that I knew what it felt like to have the ground disappear beneath your feet. So I just sat with you instead." "It was exactly what I needed," Grace said. "And every day since then, you have continued to give me exactly what I needed, even when I did not know what to ask for." Vincent raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life," he said. "Everything good that I have, everything I am, it all started the day I knocked on your gate." "And everything I am started the day I let you stay," Grace replied. They sat together as the sky turned from orange to pink to purple, watching the day surrender to night. The air cooled, carrying the scent of grass and cattle and the wild Texas earth. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, and one of the horses whinnied in response. Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate cattle drive where she had disguised herself as a man and nearly died in a stampede. The moment in Dodge City when Vincent had asked her to marry him with nothing to offer but his love and his determination. The years of hard work and careful management that had built their ranch into something prosperous and enduring. But more than any of that, she thought about the quiet moments. The evenings spent on this porch, talking or silent as the mood struck them. The way Vincent still brought her coffee every morning, exactly how she liked it. The way they could communicate with just a glance after all these years together. The way his hand still fit perfectly in hers, as if they had been designed for each other from the beginning. "I would do it all again," Grace said softly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear, I would do it all again to end up right here with you." "So would I," Vincent said, 1,000 times over. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had watched over them on the cattle drive, the same stars that had blessed their wedding, the same stars that had witnessed every triumph and every setback. The land spread out around them, this piece of Texas that had been bought with sweat and blood and tears, that had been defended with courage and saved with love. Inside the house, someone lit a lamp, and warm light spilled out onto the porch. Grace heard Clara's voice raised in laughter at something Robert had said, heard the running footsteps of grandchildren being chased to bed. This was her legacy, Grace thought. Not just the land or the cattle or the money in the bank. Her legacy was the family she and Vincent had created, the love they had nurtured, the example they had set of what partnership and commitment could achieve. She looked over at Vincent, at the man who had sat beside her without a word all those years ago and had never really left her side since. His face was lined with age now, his hair white as snow, but when he smiled at her, she still saw the quiet cowboy who had appeared at her gate asking for nothing more than a chance. "Thank you," Grace said. "For what?" Vincent asked. "For sitting down beside me," Grace said. "For staying. For loving me. For building this life with me. For everything." Vincent pulled her close, and Grace rested her head on his shoulder, feeling his arms wrap around her with the same tenderness they had shown the first time he held her. "Thank you for letting me," Vincent replied. And there they sat as the evening deepened into night. Two people who had found each other when they both needed it most. who had built something beautiful and lasting out of desperation and hope and abiding love. The ranch would continue on, passed down through generations, but it would always carry the story of Grace and Vincent Irving, of the woman who sat alone on her porch at sunset and the cowboy who sat beside her without a word and changed both their lives forever. The years continued their steady march. Grace and Vincent grew older, their movements slower but their love no less strong. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The party was held at the ranch, of course, and people came from all over the county to honor the couple who had become something of a legend. Grace was 71 now, her hair completely white but her eyes still sharp and observant. Vincent was 74, still insisting on working with the horses despite everyone telling him to take it easy. They had become that rare thing, a love story that had endured through decades, through joy and sorrow, through prosperity and hardship, growing stronger with each passing year. On a quiet evening in the spring of 1929, they sat on their porch once more. The ranch was thriving under William and Clara's management, incorporating new techniques while honoring old traditions. Thomas, their oldest grandchild, was learning the business and showing promise as a future leader. "We have been blessed," Grace said softly, her hand in Vincent's as always. "More than blessed," Vincent agreed. "We have been given a gift. Every day with you has been a gift." Grace squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that remained despite his age. She thought about the scared, grieving girl she had been, sitting alone on this porch, certain that her life was over at 21. She thought about the desperate journey north, about the moment she had fallen from her horse and thought she might die, about the instant Vincent had proposed, and she had said yes without hesitation. Every choice had led her here. Every risk had been worth taking. Every moment of fear and uncertainty had been repaid 1,000-fold in love and joy and fulfillment. "I love you," she said, words she had spoken thousands of times but which never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Vincent replied, words that had sustained her through everything life had thrown at them. The sun set in its familiar glory, painting the Texas sky in shades of fire and gold. The land stretched endlessly before them, the land they had fought for and worked for and loved with everything they had. Inside the house, their family gathered, their legacy made flesh, their love made manifest in the generations that would follow. Grace and Vincent Irving sat on their porch in the gathering darkness. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built a love story that would be told around ranch house tables for generations to come. And as the stars emerged overhead, ancient and eternal, they held each other close and were grateful for every single moment they had been given together.